Hello, everybody, and welcome into Conversations with Authors. Today, we bring to you How to Win the War on Truth by Samuel C. Spitale. But before we get to our speakers properly, please allow me to welcome you back to Book Passages Conversations with Authors. If you've seen one of these events before, well, then we're happy to see you again. But if you are new here, then Book Passage is an independently run bookstore out of the San Francisco Bay Area, and we host and run talks just like these quite often throughout the week, both in person at our Corte Madera or San Francisco stores, or right here on YouTube. As we are streaming on YouTube, and will continue to do so in the future, please consider subscribing by clicking the subscribe button just below the video. It's completely free to you, and it helps us out a lot. It feeds the algorithm so that we can get these wonderful authors out into the world. And as an added bonus, if you click the little bell right next to the subscribe button, you'll be alerted every time that we go live with one of these talks or with a pre-recorded author conversation, and you won't have to miss out on something you otherwise might have really enjoyed. If you'd like to check out our upcoming events, or like the idea of an email newsletter from us, you can find both of those at bookpassage.com. And if you'd like to check out our speaker's book today, which again is How to Win the War on Truth, you can find it using the links in the description below, or again at bookpassage.com. Lastly, and this is very important, if you have any questions for us tonight, please take the time to write them in the YouTube chat when you think of them. You can't submit your questions too early. I promise you I'll see them and I will pass them along. It's the only way to get your questions to our speakers today, so please do not miss your chance. Please write them in the YouTube chat. Now allow me to introduce Samuel C. Spitale, the author of our book today, who is a media studies expert and has written for the Huffington Post, as well as Geek Magazine and Advocate.com. Previously, he's worked at Lucasfilm, or Lucas Limited, in global product development. He is the co-author of Star Wars: Collecting a Galaxy. In conversation tonight, we have someone who stepped up. Thank you very much for doing so. With Alan Wincup, who is the former art director and current freelance illustrator. And a current freelance illustrator designer, also illustrator for this book. He is a regular contributor as well to animation and comics. It's very, very lovely to have the both of you here with us today. Please, everybody, welcome the both of them.
Thank you for having us. It's good to be here.
Hello. I guess we just start talking. Hi, Sam. How you doing?
Off to us. Yeah, good to see you.
Good to see you also. So I guess we should start with where the idea for this book came from.
Sure. I guess I'll take that question. The genesis of the book came out of conversations with friends and family after the 2016 election. There was just so much misinformation circulating during that election cycle, which to me was pretty obvious. But the more I talked to friends and family back home in Louisiana, where I grew up, the more I realized how many people, believe stuff that just simply wasn't true. So I became kind of obsessed with how to penetrate those barriers of belief. How do we help people see the bigger picture? How far back do we have to step to help people see how some of our most deeply held beliefs have really been manufactured and sold to us like any other consumer good? I guess the answer I came up with is equal parts a crash course in media literacy, part psychology lesson, and part understanding the forces of power who benefit from us believing all the misinformation, whether that's corporate or political, or often they're really just one and the same.
Right. So let's break that down a bit. What is it about mass media that people may not understand? We all use media like constantly, especially on our devices.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that we often mistake media consumption for media literacy. We consume a ton of messages, like you said, anywhere from like 4,000 to 10,000 messages a day, but we don't often distinguish between the different forms of mass communication, namely public relations or PR, advertising, publicity, branding, and then, journalism. But only journalism is concerned with actually getting to the truth, to the information, to news. The others are really just trying to sell us something, whether that's, an acid or anti-Semitism. We have a pretty narrow view of each type of mass communication. So one of the goals of the book is to get readers to see each with a wider lens. For instance, we think of marketing as promoting a new sneaker or advertising fast food or something, but it's also responsible for getting us to take a coffee break or celebrate Valentine's Day or believe incorrectly that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. All ideas that really didn't exist until successful marketing campaigns came along. Or publicity. We think of a publicity stunt as, Marilyn Monroe standing on a subway grate while, air blows up her dress. But it's also Tea Party protests or the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade or even hosting Saturday Night Live. All of those are publicity stunts. And then probably even more innocuous is like branding. It's easy to identify a product's branding, easy to see that Budweiser is the king of beers or BMW is the ultimate driving machine. But branding is also, Samuel Adams calling a Boston riot that killed 5 people a massacre, the Boston Massacre. And it's politicians labeling themselves tough on crime or having family values. Those are branding labels that rarely live up to their names.
What role does psychology play in that?
A big one, especially understanding our unconscious biases and motivations. We're all biased in some respect, whether it's being partial to people in our in group, which is, those who share our religion or ethnicity or skin tone or gender, or even favorite sports team, or, us being less hospitable to those in a perceived out group, those of a different religion, ethnicity, skin tone, gender, or rival sports team. And it's also about becoming emotionally aware, to realize when we are being manipulated emotionally. When politicians or media outlets are trying to push those buttons to make us fearful of one of those people in the out groups, or angry at those in the out groups, or to hate some of those people in the out groups. It's always a power play. And so, recognizing the negative emotions is key to being aware of those of that manipulation, which kind of leads us, to the last part: identifying the power players behind that manipulation. The single most important step in identifying lies and misinformation is to consider which powerful interest group profits most from it.
Right.
So, who benefits from denying global warming? The oil and gas industry. Who benefits by denying the harm of smoking cigarettes? The tobacco industry. Who benefits from denying structural racism? The answer is pretty obvious. The poor, the disadvantaged, they're rarely behind propaganda. Only those whose money and power are threatened. Hence why we're manipulated to believe in voter fraud or fear critical race theory, or why politicians still red bait. It's all about power, and welfare recipients or immigrants have very, very little power.
Yeah. Why did you want to go with an illustrated direction for this book?
I knew there needed to be a heavy graphic component to the book because of the critical thinking learning tool that we use throughout. And I knew the material would require lots of tables and graphs to illustrate all the socioeconomic data. And as you know, there is a lot of data. But I initially thought the book could go in one of 2 directions. The first was fully illustrated, like we did, which is kind of inspired by Michael Goodwin's Economics, if anybody's familiar with that, or even the works of Larry Gonick, which are a lot of fun too. Or it could be more spot illustrated, like a Randall Munroe book or Robert Reich's Economics in Wonderland, which is great. I figured that was the decision best left to the publisher. And so when Quirk came on board, they agreed that fully illustrating the book would make it the most accessible to the widest possible audience. And I think that was the right call, as it not only helped break down, these otherwise academic and complex concepts, but it provided a much needed dose of whimsy and humor, which I really wanted in the book. And that's where you enter the picture.
Right. So my involvement in the book lasted about a year. You obviously have had a much longer time involved with it prior to me coming on board. So what was the path like from your initial concept to manuscript to getting Quirk on board as a publisher?
Yeah, so the idea for the book actually started more as a presentation that could be used like as a lecture or workshop or something. I wasn't quite sure what it was when I started it. And then once I kind of had the, the bare bones there, I expanded that into a manuscript. And then I shopped the book proposal based on the manuscript. And then luckily, Quirk came aboard. And then I began to turn the manuscript into a graphic novel script, which required incorporating art direction. But all through that process, the manuscript remained fairly faithful to the original blueprint, even once we had a publisher on board. I think the biggest challenge or the biggest change was probably trying to narrow the scope of the material to fit into that format, which was tough because, my editor and I both thought so many of the examples were so timely and relevant that we hated to cut anything. So we ended up expanding the margins of the book by an inch, the width from like 6 to 7 inches, and that helped a lot. And I think we really squeezed in a lot more than we thought we could. The illustrations helped with that because the more data we put in illustrations or graphics, the less we had to use for text. And and that still didn't stop me the whole way from adding more data and information every time I listened to an audiobook or something. Every time I'd finish something, I'd have collected another nugget of info or something, and I try to squeeze it in. And thankfully, Quirk kept letting me right up until the very end. I think the book was initially spec'd at around like 50,000 words, and the final book, the word count's probably closer to 80,000, which is a lot of words for a graphic novel. And the handful of things that didn't make it into the final book, I pretty much made it into the audiobook. So even if you've read the
Right.
book, there's still extra content in the audio version, which came out the same day as the book did. So actually, well, let me ask you a question.
Yeah.
What did you think of the material when you first read the manuscript?
Well, I could see right from the start that this was dealing with subject matter that I thought was critically important, had become critically important over the last few years. Um, and I wasn't aware of any other material that was dealing with this issue. So I found it very exciting. Um, I knew it was going to be a big project and that it was going to be challenging, but I believed in it, and I hoped that it was going to make an impact on anybody. Even one person would be great. Hopefully, it's more than that. Um, I knew that the length was going to be a challenge, um, especially with the time frame that we were dealing with. But luckily, I'm a pretty organized and methodical person. So right away, I broke it up into manageable chunks and was able to keep on a schedule with that. One of the advantages of having been an illustrator for quite a while. The material itself is pretty academic, I guess, but you'd presented it in very plain language that made it easy to understand. And adding the artwork, I think, makes it more accessible to everybody. Um, and of course, that's sort of the ultimate goal: is we want everybody to be able to have access and to understand the concepts. And thought this was a great approach to that. I don't ever recall feeling overwhelmed by it, and hopefully nobody else will either.
Um, yeah, well, speaking of being overwhelmed, it was a pretty ambitious approval process for both of us
Yeah,
because, you know, um, it was less than a year, I think, from, signing the contract or delivering the manuscript to um, creating the graphic novel script and creating all the artwork to sending it to the printer was probably less than a year. Had you ever created that much art in such a short amount of time before?
uh, yeah, I probably have, but in a different vein. I worked as a concept artist and an art director for about 15 years, um, and I literally have done thousands of pieces of work over that time period. Some stuff I don't even remember doing. I look back on it now. It's funny to see a piece that I don't remember doing. But one job that stands out in my memory was I designed a theme park, an indoor theme park for a place in Jordan, and it was similar in scope. There was literally hundreds of drawings required for it over a very short period of time. Um, a huge job, but I've had a career that has made me pretty accustomed to heavy workloads in short time periods. So I've learned to work pretty fast. Apart from the few preliminary pages I made to convince Quirk that I was the right guy for the job, I really got into steadily working on How to Win the War on Truth in July of 2021. And I wrapped it up at the end of May this year. So it was just over 10 months of solid work that I did. I kept track of it. There was 321 pages of art and the cover. So that was a total of 757 drawings that I completed for the job. Not all of them made it in, but most of them did.
Yeah, I would say there has to be less than like 4 or 5 that didn't make it in, right?
It's pretty close to all of them, yeah.
Yeah, I squeezed every last bit that I could. Even if we had to, cut something from one page, I'd try to find somewhere else to put the sucker in. Had you previously done a lot of comic book art or book art?
I've worked on artwork for the entertainment industry. I've done CD covers, I've done online comics, I've done print comics, activity books, educational books, and I've done a fair bit of animation. So pretty diverse, but this is my first book.
Nice.
I always try to be fluent in multiple styles. It allows me to take a wider scope of projects by adapting my work to whatever best suits the job that's at hand. For this one, I knew that the drawings should keep simple, cartoony, and light. I kept a very regular line weight on it that I thought would help sort of just keep that simplicity and that accessibility to the artwork. Left to my own devices, I typically draw more in line with superhero and action stuff. I enjoy storytelling in a visual way. Sequential artwork, which is just a fancy name for comic books. Guys like Jack Kirby and Bruce Timm have had a huge influence on me. But for this book, I knew that wasn't the way to go. The concepts in the book required artwork that was going to be quieter, more sedate, to help deliver the message. I didn't want to overshadow the message and the ideas with something that was going to be too flashy. So simple images of just people talking was what worked best for this. I just wanted to make sure that everything stayed clean and simple easy to look at. Yeah, I think out of all the drawings I did, I think Quirk only ever asked me to change one drawing, which is pretty amazing. I guess they were happy. They just let me go with it, and they were great to work with.
Yeah, for the both of us. Yeah, I guess the only thing I would add about the art is I think it kind of it definitely captured the like political op-ed tone I was going for, but with a very modern, I don't know, sensibility. And so, yeah.
Well, I'm glad you said that, because that was one of the goals. I knew that sort of a political style cartoon was going to be appropriate, but I wanted to keep it a little fresh too.
Yeah, and Quirk wanted something that felt very, youthful and energized and modern, and I feel like we kind of hit all of those points. So,
Yeah.
Yeah. So which of all of the art that you did for the book was the most challenging?
That double page spread on page 168 and 169 that shows all of the think tanks interconnected with one another was a monster to work on. It doesn't look like it. It looks like a simple graph, just a bunch of circles and lines. But it was so challenging to make all those lines connect to every other dot and make sure everything was legible and they didn't get lost in the web. Um, so that ended up taking about 40 hours just on that single image, which compared to most of them, I spent 1 to 4 hours on an image. So this one was monstrous. So every time I show somebody the book, I point out that page. I say, you got to look at this one because I want my due. This was hard work on this one, but yeah, it was good.
Yeah, I knew you would say that one because it was a headache for me too.
Yeah.
But before I comment on it, why don't we see if we can show the
All right.
viewers a picture of it so they understand what we're talking about. That
Let
would
me
be
see.
very helpful since we're talking about art. If we can, and if
Yep.
you're having
Yep.
trouble, I can
Hold
try the
on.
book. Uh, but yeah, this piece, I feel like I spent an entire week on it as well, researching all of the think tanks to understand, um, yeah, to understand which think tanks were funded from, were funding who and how they were all connected. And uh, yeah, it took a long time and we kept going back and forth because it got super confusing because so many of these suckers have like similar names and
Yes.
like the names got confusing and then so many of them were either like not around anymore or they kept changing names or they were yeah, it was kind of like a goose chase sometimes.
And
Yeah, they
so
do
many
have
of them are connected to so many others. Like if you
yeah,
look at the Koch Foundation and all the lines that emanate out from it
yeah,
as just an example.
yeah, no, it really is a spider web of how they're really kind of all funded by the same handful of billionaires and wealthy families that are intent on getting this very pro corporate agenda into the political mainstream. And so, yeah. Anyway, good. I'm glad we have that up so people can see it. Yeah, and I would say I knew that would be your answer as well for what was the most difficult because
Right.
yeah, for both
So,
these.
which piece of art did you end up enjoying most from the book?
Um, let's see. There are a few, but I really do like the spread on page 94, 95. If you can call that one up while we're talking. Um, oh, there we go. So it shows the different hurdles between white people and black people in the game of life, because we talk a lot about that in the book. And that one just has so much detail. It has a great sense of humor, but I think it paints a very stark picture of what we're trying to explain.
Right.
Um, uh, how the starting line is very different, and the finish line is even more different. And I also love the way you kept finding ways to squeeze in the chimp from Bedtime for Bonzo
Hmm.
or all of the Reagan cartoons. That definitely helped make some of the Reagan art more interesting because we refer to him a lot and there's a lot of Reagan quotes. And so having the chimp in the background in a tux or watching TV or whatever was, yeah, added a lot of humor and I really like that. And you also found a way to even make a Klansman look cute and adorable, which is hard to do. And he pops up
Yeah.
a lot in the book too. So yeah, where he's like peering over art and stuff here or there. So, but yeah, what pieces of art in the book are you the most pleased with?
I agree with you on the game board piece. I'm very happy with how that turned out for all the reasons you just said. Um, I'm happy that you liked Bonzo's inclusion. Um, I just think it's ironic that at an earlier point in his career, the president was he co-starred with a chimp. And I enjoyed the idea that maybe he brought this chimp with him through the rest of his life everywhere he went. A lot of the stuff I draw is I draw for my own amusement. And if it makes me laugh, and then if it makes somebody else laugh too, that's just bonus. I do like the image of Nixon in front of the wall of the TVs. There, that was from page 36. I was happy with how that turned out, with his fingers up, framed by the two TVs at the top. And
Well, and all those TVs, we should mention, are actually frames from his Law and Order campaign ads.
yeah,
Fear-mongering Law and Order ads that Nixon ran in the late 60s.
yeah. That's I don't have the pages with the text on them, unfortunately, but that would be more clear. If anybody actually has a copy of the book, you'll get to see this in context. I scrolled past the marijuana ad here. This one is makes me laugh every time I look at it. I can't take credit for it because all this stuff was pulled from a real ad from the 20s or 30s, something like that. But I love that one of the arguments there's that about the evil marijuana is smoke that gets in youth's eyes, as if that's the worst thing that that could happen to anyone.
Right.
Just, it makes me laugh.
Uh-huh.
And then, of course, another one was the fifth horseman of the apocalypse. There, I thought that was a nice, poignant piece to round out the book on.
Yeah, no, that's a great way to end the book on that image. And you're talking about ads. If anybody's seen the book contains, God, it feels like dozens and dozens and dozens of actual vintage ads. We should
Right,
say almost every ad in the book is real. Like, we didn't have to make up. I mean, I think we made up one or two here or there to illustrate something, but by and large, pregnant women smoking cigarettes and all of
right,
that stuff is real. Like, it's crazy. Those old ads, some of them are super crazy. Besides the ads, there are also a lot of caricatures, Nixon included, but JFK, Reagan. Who do you feel like was the hardest likeness to capture for the book?
the caricatures were the part I was most nervous to tackle because that's a style that I don't typically dabble in. But it was a fun challenge, and I enjoyed rising to it. Some work better than others, but overall, I'm happy with how everything turned out. The toughest one was the image of Alec Baldwin um, on Saturday Night Live impersonating Trump. The reason that was so challenging is that it required trying to do a caricature of somebody doing a caricature and trying to capture both likenesses in one person. So that was a tough one to do. Trump himself was probably the most fun to do because he's a real life cartoon, and he just gives you so much to work with. So
Yeah.
I was able to have fun with him.
Yeah, no, I agree. And that picture you're showing is one that I feel like did we do it pretty early on, but we just kept running into trouble trying to find a place for it. But it
Yeah,
was
I
not to use.
both liked it, but he kept getting bumped to didn't really fit in anywhere.
Yeah.
I think he ended up in there somewhere.
Yeah, I think he ended up in the publicity stunt page because
Right.
which is pretty appropriate for that, what we were depicting there. And so yeah.
Right. So is there a favorite quote or a line from the book that you think most perfectly encapsulates everything?
Yeah, I mean, there are a lot of heavy quotes, but I think the epigraph to the introduction is probably most indicative of the material. It's called Brandolini's Law, and it says that the amount of energy needed to refute bullshit is an order of magnitude bigger than that needed to produce it. And that pretty much, the book demonstrates that.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, and I think that's all the questions we had for each other. And how are we doing? About 30 minutes. So at this point, I think we can open it up to the audience. For the viewers, what questions do you have, or would you like to ask us? And while some of those questions come through, I see that someone wrote about the difference between propaganda and conspiracy theories. Have been on my mind all week. Thanks for this amazing text. And so I just thought I have that a note on the difference, because I think we can easily confuse those two. But they are two different things. And so conspiracy theories usually come from the powerless, from people who feel the need to find order in a world in disarray. Conspiracy theories are more about filling a psychological need to explain events in a way that's emotionally satisfying. So momentous events must have equally momentous explanations, hence the conspiracy. Like JFK, being killed. We have a hard time accepting that a random guy could just, shoot the president of the United States and alter the world. And so it's about needing to feel secure about the absolute randomness of the world. And actually, the skeptic founder, Michael Shermer, was actually on NPR today speaking about this, because he has a new book coming out called Conspiracy. But this book, How to Win the War on Truth, is focused more on propaganda, which comes from the powerful. So propaganda is defined as any information that's biased or misleading, which is used to promote a particular point of view, usually one that benefits big business or furthers a political agenda. So in the simplest of terms, propaganda tries to sell us something. And the word propaganda comes from the church. It literally means spreading the faith. And that's the problem with propaganda, is it's selling us ideas that someone wants us to take on faith, that are usually bullshit. So whether it's, some snake oil homeopathic remedy, or the belief that global warming is a hoax, someone with power benefits from us believing that propaganda. And so that's why, one of the single most important questions to ask is, who benefits by me believing whatever it is? So anyway, I'm glad I'm glad Kim said something about that, because that gave us an opportunity to explain the difference between propaganda and conspiracy theories. Let's see. Any other questions coming in? Anybody? Feel free to send some questions. Let's see. Yeah, I see somebody saying about social studies teacher, English teacher. One of the things about the book is, it was designed to be very educational. So we actually have a class guide for the book that the publisher is working on. It should be ready, but it's, the book is definitely the kind of book that can be used if there's like comics in the classroom. There are a lot of educational initiatives these days, with books like March, and books about the civil rights movement, books about coming out, books about a lot of relevant social, socioeconomic, political issues. And so, it's a work of nonfiction, but it still is a graphic book. So it's meant to be accessible to teens, high schoolers, even middle-aged students. And yeah, it's a helpful tool in the classroom to explain some of these, tougher concepts, or just be a simple guide to critical thinking, or learning to think critically about a lot of the messages we encounter or see in the media. And so, yeah, I see someone says, yeah, the misrepresentation and manipulation of facts, that I think is truly political. Knowing when that manipulation is happening is essential to critical thinking and real independence. Yes, and So there are about, or it is a lot about critical thinking and learning the skills. Let's see, there's another question here. Any campaigns that stick out to the most? Things that we take for granted, part of our culture are actually from propaganda. Yeah, and we mentioned a few of those earlier, but there are so many things. Actually, I have the book up. I'm going to call up to show. There are so many things that like we take for granted. We just assume are part of, the culture, or beliefs that we assume are accurate, but they may not be. Like, thinking a low-fat diet is good for you, and that propaganda came from the sugar industry. Um, Thinking firearms make us safe, that propaganda came from the gun lobby. Um, Thinking marijuana is dangerous or a gateway drug or shouldn't be legalized. Um, a lot of those ideas came from either politicians or, in modern times, alcohol trade groups who don't want to lose their market share, sharing it with drugs. There are just so many things, thinking tax cuts stimulate the economy. I mean, that's pretty much created by corporations to avoid paying taxes. In fact, the opposite is true. Even thinking a diamond ring should cost 2 months' salary, that's just an arbitrary number that the De Beers diamond cartel created in their old advertising campaigns. Even the idea that Black people commit more crime than white people is propaganda. It was a way to, fight the civil rights movement, and the liberties that came with the movement, like the war on drugs, which pretty much a political response by the Nixon administration to, undermine the counterculture of the 60s, the hippie movement, and the movement for Black people getting civil rights. So yeah, a lot of what we take for granted, a lot of it's corporate, but a lot of it's political too, because again, it's about power. Who stands to lose power, who's trying to maintain power, and that's money and power, corporations, and then political people that have stakes, or could lose something. Yeah. Anyway, that was a good question too. Take for granted. Let's see. You think that propaganda can play a positive role in society? Could the powerful use it as a good rather than ill? That's a good question. I think, to me, if it's used for good, it's not as much propaganda. I think of propaganda more in the negative sense. I kind of feel like if your information that's used for good is, to me, news or just information. Like I guess the best example would be PSAs, public service announcements. I mean, you could say, yeah, Smokey the Bear is technically trying to sell us this idea of not smoking in the forest, but who benefits by that? We all do. So I don't feel like there's the manipulation involved in that kind of stuff. So I feel like you fight propaganda with information and news. And just because, a cable network has news in its name, it does not mean it's news, or journalism. So facts, journalism, information in the right context, is the best way, I feel like, to fight propaganda. But again, to me, propaganda has that kind of it's something's being sold, and I feel like, if you're trying to save the planet or be a more responsible human being, you're not really selling anything. You're just being responsible, or or altruistic. Um, but anyway, yeah. But there are a ton of examples in the book, and so there are some positive examples in there too, with PSAs and such. But as you'll see in the book, even a lot of the PSAs that we think were positive were actually not engineered that way. And I think the biggest example, which I'll read, if anybody out there remembers the Keep America Beautiful campaign from the 70s with the crying Indian. So Keep America Beautiful, it was a series of PSAs, and this group was a nonprofit organization founded by manufacturers of throwaway bottles and cans as a response to environmental regulation at the state level. So instead of working with regulators to solve America's landfill problem or developing biodegradable packaging, they just launched a massive PR campaign that put the blame squarely on consumers. So by convincing the public the problem was our fault, they successfully shifted responsibility. We were making the poor Indian cry in their commercials because we were littering, not because manufacturers were polluting the air, poisoning the groundwater, or producing materials that would outlast civilization. So the result became criminalizing litterers, not polluters. And environmental groups like the Audubon Society and the Sierra Club, who initially supported the campaign, when they discovered it was just a PR ploy by the beverage industry, even they distanced themselves. And so, yeah, so the line can be very blurred sometimes until you get to the history or the origin of something and understand it better. Let's see. Oh, here's another question. Will there be a follow-up of any sort? Book, blog to discuss exploring the ongoing propaganda? Ooh, yeah, there is a lot. Do you see this as a global propaganda diminishing in any way? Unfortunately, with the internet, we thought would be such a force for good, but what the internet has enabled is it's basically removed the gatekeepers. So traditional media used to have gatekeepers that would keep out all the nonsense and the BS. And now we no longer have that. Anybody could start a website. So we have so many bad actors that benefit either financially or politically by selling bullshit to the public. And as long as they're rewarded for selling bullshit, the best defense is critical thinking and educating people on what that bullshit looks like. Other things would be, not supporting networks and media outlets who just spread the bullshit or create the bullshit. And unfortunately, there are too many of those out there these days because, again, financially, it works out very well for them. And so, I think taking responsibility and holding businesses and corporations accountable will help a lot. But there's just so much at this point. Teaching people to think critically and to recognize, some of the key giveaways. And the book, that's its main through line is what are the giveaways of recognizing propaganda. And actually, we haven't really talked about those, so we could totally talk about that. So, like the 5 key markers of propaganda is, it reduces a complex story into a simple black and white narrative. So meaning it takes all the complexity out. And that narrative usually relies on some sort of implicit bias or cognitive bias that we're not aware of. And then that bias usually evokes a negative emotion like fear or outrage or anger or hate. And those negative emotions help divide us into in-groups and out-groups, makers and takers, us versus them. And all of that is done for the economic benefit of the power class or the powerful or whoever's paying for it. And so anyway, so I know that sounds kind of academic in discussion, but each one of those kind of gets a chapter in the book with lots of examples on, how to recognize, how to become aware of these black and white narratives, how to think of the world more in shades of gray and see the other sides to the complexity. A lot about cognitive biases, how we, implicit bias, priming and confirmation bias, becoming emotionally aware, when we, especially if like a newscaster, there's one news network in particular, their brand is basically outrage. So becoming aware if you're watching a cable news network and you're getting angry or fearful or whatever, if it's a negative emotion that's being aroused, then you're not watching news, you're watching propaganda. Because emotion, for the most part, is what actors trade in. Actors are paid to emote. But a newscaster should not be. And you think of like your local newscasters on the news late at night. or at 5 or 6 p.m. You know, they're usually pretty monotone and stoic, and they're cordial and they're empathetic, but they're not trying to get a rise out of you. They're not trying to make you hate anybody. They're not dividing the populace into us's and them's. And so, you know, the key indicator of fake news or misinformation in a media outlet is if, you know, there's a lot of negative emotion in the newscaster. And that's like often a pretty key giveaway that, you know, they're trying to manipulate you. Let's see, what is the other one? Great resource. Oh, can't find the education guide. We haven't, I don't think the class guide is available yet, but I did follow up with the publisher this week to see where we are with the class guide. So I would assume once the class guide to the book becomes available, it will be online on the Quirk website. And I think that hits most of the questions, I think. Yeah, so I guess back to Nick.
Thanks, everyone.
My natural light is dimming, so perfect timing.
Oh, perfect then. Thank you everybody for such excellent questions. I tossed not a couple. I tossed one of mine in there, so I'm thank you for answering that as well. It was very nice of you. It's good to see so many people people just commenting as well. I enjoyed the discussion going on in the chat. I did relay several of the comments over, so don't you worry. They saw what you were writing, so don't worry about that. Thank you everybody one last time for coming out, for not only supporting Book Passes, but for supporting wonderful authors and illustrators like the two wonderful people we have here today. One last time, the book is How to Win the War on Truth, available at bookpassage.com. We can ship it to your house just like any other online retailer. Yes, even like that one. And if you live outside the United States, you can give us a call at the store, and we'll figure out a way to get international shipping to you. But other than that, thank you very much, everybody, for coming out. And one last time, thank you for joining us. We hope to see you in the next one. Bye.
Thank you.